I once believed silence was sacred, until
Listen, a city's memory keeps its own hour.
Remay, attend, bless.
Let the hour belong to your breath.
Stay with the 13th hour. Begin.
I once believed that silence was sacred. The first lesson they teach you when the collar is new and the world still smells of incense is that holiness lives in quiet rooms and low voices. I repeated that lesson to others for years, until I noticed that the quiet itself had a body, a pulse, and that sometimes it pressed back when you leaned into it. What I had called reverence was, in fact, weight. What I had called peace was pressure. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. I am not giving you my name, not for melodrama, not to tease. The name you would search on, the parish you might find, the photographs where the sky behind me is the patient Italian blue, those are all already edited. If I told you my name, you would meet the version of me that was assembled for you, and then you would say you had checked. Truth would become a receipt. That is the first way memory is domesticated. It is filed and stamped until it cannot bite. What I will give you is a smell, because smells are harder to fake and harder to forget. Imagine the breath of vellum that has slept too near a candle, a sweetness barely above scorch, with a metallic seam running through it like the promise of a storm that will never break. That is the smell of the door I am about to open. You cannot see the door, so I will draw its edges with words. It is plain, undecorated, set in a corridor where the air tastes as if color has been shaved off it. Everyone passes by that corridor. No one notices the subtraction until it is too late. I swore never to open that door again. When I left Rome, when I folded my cassock for the last time, when I pressed a palm against the cool plaster in a boarding house with a view of rooftops and television antennas, I promised a future version of myself that the door would remain in the past. But the strange arithmetic of vows is that they become doors of their own, swinging noiselessly in dreams. In my dreams, the door opens by itself, each time a fraction wider, each time a fraction closer to breath. Let me begin, then, not with my ordination or with the first Mass I served, but with a small inventory note. In those days, I kept keys, a ring of them, dull and heavy, rattling like a minor argument in my pocket. We pretended they were mundane, keys to reading rooms, to cabinets, to stairwells, keys that squealed politely, keys with the good manners of brass. But among them was one that felt slightly warm in the palm no matter the season, as if the metal had learned to keep a memory of human skin. That key belongs to the door. If you ask for maps, I can tell you only this. What I am calling the shadow corridor does not appear in the cheerful pamphlets you are handed with your ticket. Tour guides do not pause there to let the air settle after an enthusiasm. No one says, "To your left, the corridor that drinks color." But on a certain blueprint, smudged with the fatigue of reproduction, there is a line drawn by a hand that pressed too hard near the margins. You can follow it with a finger. You can feel the pressure, The line ends at a rectangle, and the rectangle has no label. I learned the corridor by accident, or so I thought then. As a novice librarian, I was given a task with the exact size of innocence. Audit chained books for worm damage. There is an entire vocabulary for such labors: foxing, frass, bloom, that sounds like a weather report from a country where the seasons are made of paper. We ran a finger under the iron links and along the leather spines, the way a physician, careful and practiced, might check a pulse. The chains were not for the worms. They were for us. The first time I reached for the warm key on the ring, I did not mean to. We had finished our inspection for the day, and the senior archivist, a man who smelled faintly of herbal pastilles and precision, had said the word adjacent in that way administrators use when they do not want to admit they are pointing. Adjacent to the minor cabinet of hagiographies, adjacent to the stairwell where the light throws an amber scandal at 4 in the afternoon, adjacent to the place where the floor dips by the thickness of a coin. There, he said, a supplemental index, if I wanted to be thorough. He smiled, or at least arranged his face into the suggestion of one. There are smiles designed to be noticed by the receiver and ignored by the room. His was a private weather system. I nodded and said I wanted to be thorough. The lock accepted the warm key politely, like a throat swallowing after a pause. The door opened with no ceremony at all, as if it had always expected my knuckles and my bones and my breath. The smell rose vellum near flame, storm metal, and the light dimmed as if persuaded, not commanded. There are degrees of dimness. Most people only know 1 or 2. In the corridor there were 10. Each step shaved a color from the spectrum, until gold leaf looked gray, and gray looked thoughtful, and black began to reveal itself as several shades of sleep, arguing with one another. My eyes adjusted the way animals' eyes do in stories. In reality, eyes never adjust. The mind does. I did what you would have done. I told myself I was still in the known building. I told myself that every secret room has a corresponding approval, a form signed once upon a time by a man whose signature loops still dazzle under a glass case. I told myself that if I had a key, someone had, at some point, asked for my name and written it legibly in a ledger. All of this is true and useless. Bureaucracy, like theology, is always correct at the level of ink. Inside, the shelves had a posture. If you spend enough days among books, you begin to detect the ways they lean toward or away from you. Pleading, allergic, skeptical, aroused. The volumes in the shadow corridor lounged with the confidence of things that did not need to be read to know they were being read. Their leather was not always leather. In certain angles of the tired light, you could see pores that did not belong to the animals you expect. The cow's plaza, the sheep's patient hillside. There was a fineness to the grain, as if the skin had learned to memorize letters from within, and now, bound on the outside, was satisfied to lie still. On a plinth near the door waited a folio that announced itself only by refusing to be ignored. I did not mean to touch it. I touched it. Its title, in a script that had been taught to fear its own flourishes, read, Memoriam on the Governance of Forgetting. Governance, not theology, not medicine. Governance, as if forgetting were a province with a budget and an anthem. I turned a page and saw the first diagram, a city drawn as a rose with its petals numbered, and along the margins a neat hand, noting how quickly names fade the farther they are planted from a certain center. The center was not a church. I will not tell you what it was. You would go there, and you would be disappointed that it was only a kiosk. Next to Memoriam, tucked half under a chain that had been draped with the cruelty of accident, lay De Temporum Vacuo, of the empty centuries. I remember placing a fingertip in the notch where a seal had been broken, the wax scar smelling faintly of coins and thunder. The pages did not argue, they invited. A table listed feast days, with annotations that were not pious at all. Small adjustments to prevent certain alignments, off by one corrections designed to make constellations arrive late to their appointments. There were drawings of meridian lines carved along cathedral floors, each a blade that had been dulled on purpose. And there, in a cramped paragraph, a phrase nibbled the edge of my training: phantom time. I had come across the hypothesis years earlier in pamphlets traded by students with a taste for cleverness. The pamphlets had been beige with embarrassment. The folio was not embarrassed. Do not imagine lightning. Imagine, instead, the feeling of having been corrected gently by someone you love in a small kitchen late at night. A mercy and a theft. That was my feeling, standing with a chain across my wrist, while a book made of animal and idea suggested that we had not been following the sun so much as herding it. On a lower shelf, where the dust had developed that polite crust which tells you your curiosity is punctual rather than original, a ledger lay open to a page of names in a disciplined red. I recognized several. Some were saints who had escorted me through childhood as if carrying lanterns. Beside others' names I did not know was a sigil repeatedly sketched until the pen lifted in satisfaction, a feather crossed by a blade. The archivist's smile returned to me like a migraine. I made a note of the sigil in my head the way you memorize a stranger's face in a city you might dream about later. When I asked him, days afterward, what the feather meant, he wiped an invisible dot of ash from his cuff and murmured, "They kept the halos but removed the wings." He was joking, I thought. No one jokes in Latin under a lungful of dust. There were maps, not of continents, those tired outlines that pretend the world is obedient to surfaces, but of star paths. Someone had traced the procession of the heavens onto the nave, the way a careful mother measures a stubborn child against the kitchen door frame. Here we were, here we are, here we would like to be. Lines ran from the Vatican obelisk through a point in the floor where tourists take photographs of their shoes. A bronze disc set into the stone, which I had walked over 100 times, now insisted on being a coin in a giant's palm. Marginal notes in a tight, clever hand instructed a reader to adjust liturgical hours, to conceal drift. I pictured clocks being shuffled like cards, while the city slept and woke and prayed. I will not tell you everything I saw that day. No one tells everything. That is not how confession works, however many hours the booth stays lit behind its grill. But I will tell you this. The shadow corridor was not an antechamber to absurdities. It was a workshop. The trope you prize in fiction men with candles in cavernous rooms, frightened by their own knowledge, was not present. Nothing cinematically haunted. The terror was administrative. The dread wore spectacles and a cocoon of light from a green-shaded lamp. The horror was how reasonable it all wanted to be. I left the corridor with a headache that felt as if a small cart was being pushed up a hill behind my eyes. The world outside was indecently bright, and the sounds of ordinary Roman business, the bargaining, the laughter, spilled from doorways like soap, felt as if they had been dubbed in after the fact. The archivist was at his desk, marking an afternoon with the patience of an undertaker in a town where everyone dies on schedule. He asked, without raising his eyes, if I had found the supplemental index. I said yes. He nodded into the paper as if my answer were an alibi he had been rehearsing for me since before I was born. For weeks after, I convinced myself that nothing had changed. I performed the little ceremonies of habit, the cup of coffee that tastes like a sentence completed, the walk past the courtyard where pigeons insist on being ridiculous, the way you say good evening to a guard who will never look the way television teaches you guards should look. But the door began to open in my sleep, gaining an inch of grace with each night, and the smell of warmed vellum threaded itself into hours that had previously belonged to clean things, linen, rain, the interior of a chapel at the precise moment the sunlight off the floor loses interest in being gold. When the mind cannot bear to admit what it knows, it takes up small hobbies. Mine became eavesdropping on the building, the language of wood that has never forgiven the carpenter, the whispers of catalog cards like insects surveying a field, the gossip of keys knocking each other on my ring with the offhand intimacy of men who have shared a barracks. From those noises I learned the habits of a second city built under the visible one. You would be surprised how often doors speak to one another about the humans who think they control them. On a Thursday, the day that sags under the weight of everyone's half-kept promises, I returned to the corridor, not out of bravery, out of boredom with my denial. A life can become so carefully maintained that the maintenance is indistinguishable from worship. I brought no one with me. Secrets do not fear witnesses. Witnesses fear being the only ones who saw. I will not recruit you into that fear. You are listening. That is enough. Inside, the light measured me and decided I was the same person as before. It allowed me to proceed. The folios had shifted by centimeters that would not have alarmed a less anxious eye. Memoriam lay open where I would have closed it. De temporum vacuo was neatly shut, as if punished for enthusiasm. A new presence announced itself, without pages. A cabinet of narrow drawers whose brass handles were polished to the color of compliant honey. Each drawer had a number stamped on a small enamel plate, and each number offered the promise of being the one that told the truth. Drawers, like people, always imply that the true one is just to the right of the one you've opened. I chose a number no one chooses, 31, because you cannot be accused of superstition if you sin past the boundary of the month. The drawer slid out with a dry sigh that sounded like a veteran excusing himself from a party. Inside, index cards the precise color of old teeth weighted in bundles tied with cotton ribbon. The first card read, "On the removal of wings from iconography, a practical guide for parish painters." The second, "Adjustments to the calendar for the masking of stellar processions, to be applied gradually." The third, "Procedures for the translation of saints, administrative." That parenthetical, tossed like a handkerchief over the face of a corpse, did what poetry cannot. It offered a cruelty no metaphor could soften. Translation. In our public vocabulary, the word meant the movement of relics from one holy place to another. In the shadow corridor, it meant the removal of a name from history so deftly that no one would ever ask where to send flowers. I was not alone in the corridor. Presence in such places is not always an invasion. Sometimes it is a distant cousin of permission. A shape at the end of the aisle, not hurrying, neither avoiding nor approaching, reached its hand toward a shelf and withdrew it without an object. The movement had the modesty of someone checking whether a coat belonged to them. When I turned to register the shape fully, it was a column, of course, and a trick of posture I had lent to stone. That is how the mind writes companions for you when you risk speaking to a room it prefers you survive. The night that followed was the thinnest I have slept. I woke on the hour, and on each hour I thought, now is the time when ordinary clocks go on obediently and secrets feed. I walked the apartment with the practiced gravity of insomniacs. When I brushed against the chair that served as a coat rack, the keys killed their quarrel and arranged themselves into the quiet of soldiers anticipating a count. There are sounds that become more articulate at 2 in the morning. The ring of metal on metal said, "Go back." I did. A man cannot claim to confess and then delay. You must either own the shame of your hesitation or cut through it. I am tired of owning. I cut. On that return, the corridor offered me something I had not known I wanted, a ledger of attendance. There were years listed that belonged to no calendar you can buy. Names beside them, and beside the names a small mark present, absent, excused, all in a red ink that seemed to refuse to dry fully, as if it had been mixed with a measure of dusk. I found my own handwriting on a line I had no memory of signing. My name. The date in a format I would never use. The mark beside it. Present. The ink was still damp. I pressed a fingertip there and, instead of smudging, felt the oddest sensation. The ink resisted and then accepted me, the way an ocean receives a footstep in the shallows. I wiped my finger on my palm and found a stain in the shape of a feather crossing a blade. You begin to understand, then, why I left without ceremony. A man who finds his name written inside a ledger he does not remember signing begins to wonder whether he has traveled forward or backward in his own life. The fear is not that he has been caught. The fear is that he has been catalogued accurately. I moved through the city those days like an actor who has decided to play his role as if he were slightly invisible. The market sellers arranged their fruit into those affectionate pyramids that make you believe geometry has a hunger of its own. Tourists worried the map of Rome, as if worrying it harder would cause the buildings to consent to being closer together. In the churches, the murmurs carried like seas forgiving rocks, and under it all, the knowledge that there exist rooms where the hours are edited and where wings are sanded off faces so that children will not ask whether angels tire when they fly. I am telling you this now not to accuse the dead or to frighten the living, but to inoculate you against a particular trick. You will hear me and think yourself brave for hearing. Bravery is not what the corridor asks for. It has always been indifferent to heroics. What it demands is a willingness to admit that you have been the beneficiary of clerical kindnesses you never noticed. That the city you love is, in part, the result of an agreement between memory and fear, and that, having benefited, you may still choose to look directly at the agreement and say, "No, thank you." A minute more, and I will close this door for tonight, because doors, unlike secrets, require a body to move them. Before I do, take this with you. Not a date or a headline, not a theorem dressed as gossip, but an instruction. When you next stand under a dome that has learned how to cage light without bruising it, look down. Cathedrals are riddled with maps that pretend to be floors. Find the thin line that announces itself at noon in winter and at nothing in summer. Follow it to the small brass disc set into the stone like a coin in a giant's palm. Put your shoe on it. Now imagine a line running from that coin to an obelisk outside, to a star you cannot see, to a drawer in a corridor that does not exist, to a key that is always warm, to a name written in red ink that refuses to dry. Imagine the line running to you. If you can imagine that, you are ready to hear the rest. I say this as a man who knows the kindness and cruelty of paper. I say it as someone who once believed that time was a choir we could tune if only we were gentle enough with the pitch pipe. I say it as someone who has held a page that burned cold and has heard a bell ring at an hour that does not exist. I say it as a coward who left and as a witness who has returned, because a door that opens by itself is not a door but an instruction, and disobedience, I have learned, is sometimes the most devout thing a man can practice. There, the door, for now, is closed. I have set the key on the table and watched the metal refuse to cool, as if it still remembers all our hands. My palms carry the faintest trace of dust, a persistent perfume of years behaving themselves. The city outside is making the noises cities make when they try to convince you that morning will be ordinary. Listen closely, and you will hear it, the soft arithmetic of memory and fear, adding and subtracting the days we call ours. Tomorrow I will tell you about the feather and the blade, about the drawings that learn to lie, about the names translated so elegantly that their absence counts as good manners. For tonight, keep this smell with you. Vellum near flame, storm about to happen. It is the smell of a door you cannot see, opening an inch closer to breath each time you remember it. Remember it. I did not return to the door because I was brave. I returned because ordinary light began to look counterfeit, and because I had acquired a tolerance for the aftertaste of dust. You drink enough of a place, and its sediment rearranges your blood. I woke with the sound of a page turning in a room that was not mine. When I sat up, the sound stopped. When I lay down again, it started the imagination's pulley system, lifting and lowering a bucket in the well where memory collects the colder water. I dressed and let the city put its soft hands on my shoulders. The key was already warm. The corridor greeted me without ceremony, a patience older than furniture holding its shape. The air had the quality of thought not yet spoken. I could hear footsteps above tourists, drawing maps with their feet, guards drafting sentences with their shoes, but down here, the only walking belonged to time. I stood very still, the way a good thief studies a room before admitting his appetite, and waited for the shelves to decide whether I was a reader or a witness. The difference matters. A reader believes a book is an object. A witness understands the object has opinions. The chained books announce themselves with a sound like low rain swallowed by wood. Each chain looped back to its ring with an obedience that was neither pious nor fearful. It was practiced. The iron links left faint shadows on leather, small moons eked out by the habits of years. We tell ourselves chains are for the wickedness of books, to prevent them from wandering into hands that would misunderstand. The truth is more tender and more cruel. The chains keep us from being seduced by what would otherwise step off the plinth and follow us home. Memoriam lay open on the page titled On Circles of Retention. The diagram showed a city mapped by degrees of forgettability, the innermost ring tattooed with names that refuse to be erased, the outermost neighborhoods where histories peel off like paint after a wet winter. The script, an obedient Latin, noted, "Where the mind gathers, Time thickens. I thought of parish festivals that build a fence around a calendar day so the year can locate itself when it gets lost. In the margin, a smaller hand had added, "If thickness can be farmed, so can thinness." The phrase worked in my head like a splinter dressed as a proverb. De temporum vacuo had changed its mind overnight. Yesterday it kept its lips together. Today it parted them a fraction. The chapter, Corrections and Disguises, listed minor shifts to feast days that would nudge congregations away from antique star conjunctions. Nothing heretical on its face, just housekeeping with a cosmic broom. A note in the same slim hand that loved margins read, "A holy hour is a hinge. Move it, and the door looks different even when it stays closed." I looked up at the corridor's ceiling, shallow curved, a tunnel that had decided not to be a throat, and wondered how many doors the city keeps that are only recognizable to the hours designed to open them. The ledger of red names waited where I had left it, patient in the way scales are patient with fish. A new red line, damp, had bled slightly into the fiber, resolving into the exact tint of old wounds that finally decided to heal. Beside familiar names, a tiny crossed feather mark, perched as if prepared to fly. You do not expect ink to have posture. You do not expect your own body to mirror it. But I felt my shoulders hitch into the angle the mark suggested, vigilance interrupted by usefulness. They kept the halos, but removed the wings. The archivist's sentence returned and stood beside me, hands politely folded. The corridor is unsentimental, but it likes a sentence that can carry two buckets. We keep the light, we erase the capacity to leave. We preserve sanctity, we domesticate the escape route. I thought of paintings where angels hover like lanterns and realized I could not recall exactly how their feathers had been painted, whether the brush had given them motion or merely the idea of motion. I made a note to look. The mind keeps a notebook even when the hands are empty. Past the chained plinths, a short stair fell away, like a sigh made out of stone. I descended, one palm on the wall. Registering temperature changes the way a pianist registers a piano's mood before rehearsal. The lower room was smaller, closer to the human scale of an admission. Cabinets with glass fronts stood with the embarrassed elegance of creatures that know they are being looked at and pretend they do not mind. Inside, maps that were not of land. The lines traced the sky onto floors and domes, then folded themselves into schedules. This bell at this angle, that prayer at that declination. I had been taught the Roman Church loved order. I had not been told it tuned the city to a song whose sheet music was written by astronomers who had once worn the word magus like a surname. One case held a brass instrument I could not name. It looked like a protractor that had traveled through a century of theology and come out shy. A tag read, "Meridian Apportioner," used to pace the liturgical hour so the populace never learns the sky is late. I felt the tiniest insult bloom in my chest, not because I believed the populace fragile, but because I understood how fragile the pact must have been if such tools were required. Someone had not trusted time to act like itself in front of the faithful. There was a drawer wall built of narrow compartments, the enamel numbers small oaths against chaos. Drawer 31 had already introduced itself. Today, I slid out 30, because superstition is a leash you only pretend to drop. The bundle inside smelled of cotton and adjectives. The top card read, "On the Practice of Translation, Administrative." Beneath, a set of protocols enumerated the steps by which a saint could be removed from public memory without upsetting the sacral budget of a city. First, evaluate cult density. Second, reassign patronage. Third, dilute iconographic prevalence by substituting near-identical figures. Fourth, redistribute feast day to an already crowded liturgical week. Fifth, explain in pastoral letters that no change has occurred, only modernization of emphasis. I have counseled grief. I have held parents after a child's accident. I have presided over the long, soft funerals of marriages. Nothing in my training had prepared me for the gentleness with which a person could be erased. Another card. Wings in iconography. Removal or concealment. A list of techniques followed. How to sand down the implication of flight without insulting the theology of angels. How to invite the eye to rest on faces and hands, so the absence of feathers registers as dignity rather than subtraction. How to praise weight as presence. I had believed art history to be a series of migrations of style. The card suggested it was also a ledger of what we had been warmed away from seeing. I stood too long at that drawer, and the corridor dimmed a degree, as if warning me that attention is a current that deserves not to be dammed. I slid 30 back and pulled 29. The bundle here was heavier. At the top, adjustments to the civil calendar for the masking of stellar procession, confidential. The handwriting grew more cramped, as if the writer had tried to fit urgency into lines too narrow for their panic. There were annotated tables showing how slight shifts in public clocks could dislocate the populace's intuition about when a particular star rose. A phrase, "Do not permit the city to attend the sky as if it were a performance." Another, "Miracles cannot be curated if the audience learns to keep time with nature." I felt the oldest argument in the church, the right of authority to narrate reality and place its calm hand on my shoulder. I was, after all, a product of that hand. It had steadied me through storms of doubt and lust and ordinary rage. Its pressure had often been a mercy. Standing with those cards spread like playing pieces in a game played across centuries, I decided not to be grateful. I closed the drawer wall. The corridor brightened by a hair, the light's compromise restored. In the far corner, under a vault that pretended not to be an echo, a reading table waited with a chair whose back was shaped to accept the posture of a person who would tell the truth later. I sat and found the little groove all librarians make in wood over years of replacing pens with attention. Someone had left a pencil, a defiance disguised as utility, right where the right hand of a certain nerve would find it. There is a moment in any descent when you test whether your mind has enough air. I tested mine by thinking of ordinary errands, mending a cuff, calling my mother, buying fruit so ripe the vendor shakes his head at your luck. The thought of fruit helped. It corrected the corridor's suggestion that only memory mattered. Then the ledger caught my eye again and offered me the only kindness it possessed, the chance to read my own name without shock. There it was, recorded in a year that had not yet happened, written in a steady hand I recognized as my own. The mark beside it, the crossed feather, had dried. The feather leaned toward the blade, as if curious about its edge. The staircase I had used to enter wavered in my peripheral vision, the trick that places play when they have adopted you and want to see whether you will accept the adoption. I stood, and the corridor's temperature dropped by a quantity a thermometer would call negligible, and a body would call decision. On the plinth, by the stairs, A new folio had appeared, or else it had always been there, and I had not yet learned to admit it. The binding was the color of weather made obedient. The title, stamped deep and rubbed with a wax that reminded me of church floors after a feast day, read Ordo Vigilans, on the Wingless Angels. Beneath, hand-lettered in a smaller script, for internal edification, external silence. I lifted the cover and found not doctrine but minutes, records of meetings in which practical saints not canonized, only competent, debated whether to concede certain theological ornaments to preserve more important scaffolding. A woman's voice captured in the secretary's precise phrases suggested removing wings from certain angelic depictions to prevent the imagination from attempting emigration. The argument was not against angels, but against flight as a temptation in a city trying to persuade itself that holiness is local. Another voice, a man, cautioned that removing wings from images could lead to their removal from memory. The secretary recorded the laughter that followed, with a dash and a note. Humor permitted for 2 minutes. Severity resumed. The pages described routes beneath European cities, corridors of memory mapped alongside aqueducts and sewers and catacombs. The metaphor had not been a metaphor at all. Teams of the Ordo Vigilans surveyed, where forgetting seeped fastest, and patched the leaks with festivals, processions, relics, pageants. A civic theology of retention. There were charts of which hymns thickened time, which sermons thinned it, which foods served at which hours rendered people briefly immune to the seductions of oblivion. It was all so heartbreakingly practical that I had to close the book and rest my forehead against my knuckles. The work of saving souls, it turned out, had included the unromantic labor of saving afternoons. I understood, looking at those minutes, why the wings had to go. Wings imply horizon, and horizon implies elsewhere, and elsewhere implies comparison. Nothing undermines an arrangement like the suspicion that it could have been arranged differently. The Ordo Vigilans wanted to love a city enough to keep it from tearing itself into the future too abruptly. They had chosen weight as love's instrument. They had asked painters to teach gravity. They had asked priests like me to narrate steadiness as virtue. The tenderness of it troubled me more than any cruelty could have. A page near the book's end was blistered, where a drop of wax had landed and hardened. Under the blister, an oath, the kind that tastes of iron when you say it aloud. We forfeit wings to walk among them. We forfeit names to recall theirs. When I read it, the corridor's dimness collected itself under my ribs. This was what the archivist had meant by the joke, "Only dust can survive." Halos without wings, memory without credit. I almost left then, before the corridor could tilt the ground beneath my feet, but a small reflex of courtesy made me tidy the table. As I did, a folded sheet slipped from the Ordo Vigilans folio and landed like a shallow breath. It was a diagram of street. Peter's floor with a line drawn from the obelisk outside to the bronze disc people photograph without asking what a coin is doing in a church's hand. Along the line were marks like stitches. Next to them, the name of a star that has not been visible from this latitude for centuries. The note in the small, clever hand: realign the hour of prayer. Let the city forget the sky is walking away. I felt then not outrage. That is for the newly initiated not even sorrow, which too quickly becomes a mirror. I felt complicity, the oldest human temperature. I had prayed on those hours. I had tuned my breathing to those bells. I had accepted the gift of not attending the sky too closely. If I was injured, I had been injured kindly. Upstairs, a heavy cart rolled past. The stone absorbed the wheel's sermon and offered me its summary. You can carry anything if you go slow. I placed the folded sheet back where it belonged and turned to leave. My hand hovered over the key, anticipating the cool intelligence of metal against palm. Before I could touch it, somewhere down the corridor a bell rang. Not loud, not theatrical. Once. The sound reverberated without swelling, like a question asked by a person who already knows the answer and wants only to see if you will tell the truth. There is no 13th hour. We teach children this early so that they may trust schedules. In the corridor, the bell insisted otherwise. The sound shook the memory locks on drawers I had not dared to open. I took a single step back toward the stair and felt the light grow simpler around me, as if it were tired of its own range of grays and wanted to be merely itself for a minute. I should have left. Instead, I walked toward the sound. It led me past the cabinet of maps to a narrow door half hidden by a shelf that had outgrown its original ambition. No keyhole, no handle, only a seam with a patient idea of itself. I pressed my fingers against the line and felt the minute vibration of machinery that had learned to imitate stillness. The door did not open. It admitted me, the way a crowd shifts to accommodate one more body. Inside, a room no larger than a sacristy held a single object on a waist-high stand, a wooden case bound with an unlovely strap. The strap was the color of weathered leather. Under my thumb, it did not behave like skin. Warmth radiated a fraction above the room's own calculation. I lifted the buckle. The case opened the way careful men open their mouths before they decide whether to speak. On the velvet inside, the book lay with the indifference of a thing that has already decided who will read it. The spine's stamp matched the crossed feather sigil. The title, lettered in an alphabet that flirted with Latin and then eloped with secrecy, read, Pactum Coriae Daemonis, the Demonhide Pact. In another life, perhaps, I would have called for a supervisor. In my actual life, I traced a letter not because I am a man who needs to touch to believe, but because the room announced that belief was beside the point. The texture under my fingertip was not a trick. The binding's warmth was not the heat of lamps. This was a book that remembered bodies. I did not read it then. I tell you this so that you will not think me greedy. I closed the case, fastened the strap, returned the buckle to its faint habit of clicking. I left the secret room and watched it recline into the wall as if it had never been. The corridor breathed again the way buildings do when a particular conversation has ended. The bell did not ring a second time. On the stairs, I paused. Not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that the next time I came here, I would no longer be a novice in ignorance. There is a cost to graduating from not knowing. The first payment is the way ordinary colors lose some of their complacency. The second is the way sounds acquire context. The third, the most wickedly priced, is that you become responsible for your own memory. No institution can carry it for you without charging interest. Up in the corridor of permitted light, the archivist was shelving a dictionary with the delicacy of someone placing a bird back into its cage. He looked up. Our eyes met at a distance, careful enough to keep the day civil. Adjacency, he said, as if continuing a lecture I had agreed to attend. It is a dangerous kindness. It lets you pretend you remain where you began. He adjusted the dictionary's spine by the width of a shy apology. Close enough, he added. and returned to work. I stepped into the sun and was startled by the vulgar generosity of it. Tourists arranged themselves into the shapes of postcards. A child cried because a pigeon refused to obey. The city did what cities do. It pretended it had invented noon. I walked home holding my pocket, like a man keeping a promise from falling out. The key burned a polite hole in my attention. That night, I tried to pray. The prayer would not stand up under its own weight. Words I had leaned on for years, clean, sturdy words, tested on battlefields, hospital corridors, wedding kitchens, would not press their shoulders to my need. It was not that faith had fled. Faith is slower than that, stubborn as a mule who knows which hills deserve climbing. It was that the hours had loosened their stitching, and the day no longer felt sewn to itself. Time, which had always behaved in me like a chorister who knows his part, had decided to sing harmony until I earned the melody. I sat at the desk where bills and letters negotiated their little truces and wrote 4 words on a scrap of paper: I will go back. The promise was not brave. It was administrative. Even secrets require scheduling. I placed the scrap under a cup I did not intend to lift. In the night, when I turned, the cup moved on its own, and the scrap slid free. The words were visible in the weak light from the street. Memory is a clerk who hates being dismissed. In the morning, I obeyed. The corridor accepted me with the indulgence institutions reserve for men they still believe can be useful. I went straight to the half-hidden door. It yielded without pretending we were strangers. The case on the stand emitted the faintest scent of old wax and newer iron. I opened it and smiled without meaning to. Smiles escape under certain pressures the way steam escapes from pots. The Demonhide Pact began as minutes, became an agreement, matured into policy, decayed into habit. Its opening pages stated what everyone in power convinces themselves of, eventually: that the populace must be protected from the full glare of reality, lest it lose its appetite for meaningful work. Protection, they wrote, would be achieved by cultivating holy ignorance, not as stupidity but as the artful salting of knowledge with awe. Awe, without leverage, a bishop's marginal scrawl corrected. The pact treated memory as an animal useful, beautiful, and in need of fencing. There were signatories. Names I knew, and names the Church never taught me, because the categories do not accommodate them. Astronomer priests who could take a cathedral's pulse with a pendulum. Abbesses who kept laboratories with the discipline of gardens. A mapmaker whose ink refused to dry when lies were instructed to travel over it. Guilds of carvers who specialized in removing wings from frescoes without scarring the sky behind them. Jesuits argued with Rosicrucians in a Latin gone sharp with courtliness. They agreed on the need for a wall. They argued about its height. I should have been angry. I should have recited the catechism of transparency I had heard moderns intone over espressos. But the Pact's pages were not villainous. They were tired. They wanted a world where markets opened on time and poets still believed the moon took attendance. They feared that without curation, reality would make a mess of itself in public. "We will be blamed," a cardinal wrote in a hand that looked like an apology. "We will be blamed for chaos we did not cause, only failed to corral." He was not wrong about blame. He was wrong about what the corrals do to animals who dream of longer grass. Near the middle of the book, a section titled Contingencies catalogued breaches. In one city, a choir boy learned the star songs the Ordo Vigilans had used to seal a corridor of memory. His singing in an alley opened it a crack. The streetlights flickered. A statue lifted its hand and then decided against blessing. In another, a guild of printers set a calendar ahead by a day as a prank. The joke cut a liturgical hinge. A procession arrived under a sky not prepared to receive it. "The populace will not notice," a note insisted. Another hand added, "The populace always notices, but it forgives quickly when bread is warm." I closed the book before the last section, not because I lacked stomach, but because I understood that reading the oath would make me complicit in a way that glancing had not. There is a point on every slope where a man, still upright, realizes he has already fallen. I wanted to keep one foot on the top of the hill for one more day, one more hour, one more breath. When I emerged from the secret room, the corridor held its breath. Then it exhaled me carefully toward the stairs. At the threshold, the archivist stood, not blocking me, not inviting me. The exact posture of a doorman who knows the building is also a character in the story and deserves its entrances. "You are taking notes," he said, as if remembering a weather report. I said nothing. "Good," he continued, not kindly, not unkindly. "Notes are promises written to a later self who will accuse you of exaggeration." "Why chains?" I asked, startling myself with the ordinary boldness of the question. He considered the shelves the way a shepherd counts without moving his lips. "Because a book is an animal," he said at last. "Some must be tethered until the field is safe." He smiled the way sunlight smiles at a narrow window. "And because some shepherds are not yet sure which way their flock will run." I left him to his flock. The city, too, kept its herd, moving trams, cars, the occasional swarm of scooters that sounded like theology being argued by bees. I made myself walk to the river. "Water is a grammar that forgives." I repeated to the Tiber what I had learned, not the nouns, not the names, only the verbs. Erase, adjust, translate, conceal, relocate, realign. The river shrugged the way rivers shrug. It has been curated by emperors and masons and electric companies. It is still water and movement and brown. That evening, I called my mother and asked her to tell me a story she had told me 100 times about my grandfather walking in snow to deliver bread when he was a boy. She told it. She added a detail. I did not remember how the boy had tucked a hot loaf under his shirt to keep his chest warm. Memory writes edits without announcing them. I did not correct her. I thanked her for the new warmth. Then I returned to the apartment's small chapel of a desk and wrote another note under the first. The bell rang once. I stared at the words until the ink looked like bruised light. I blew on the paper, though it did not need drying. We blow on ink because we like to pretend we control how quickly things become permanent. Sleep found me, as it finds men who have climbed down ladders into rooms where logic holds a candle for wonder. Not all at once, and not with the courtesy of dreams. When the morning came, it did so with the sound of a tram bell. 2 quick notes, cheerful, insistently ordinary. I laughed out loud, a laughter with too much edge. 2 bells this time. The corridor's bell had rung only once. I thanked the tram for its secular mercy. By the 3rd day, the descent had begun to reorganize the surface. I noticed where the city's memory was thinnest, corners where graffiti never sticks, steps tourists photograph only in black and white because color sulks there, a small square where pigeons refuse to land. I watched a couple argue under a clock that insisted on being 3 minutes wrong. The argument ended when the woman looked up and adjusted her watch. She forgave the clock, which meant she forgave the man. I wanted to tell her she had just participated in a liturgy no bulletin would print. I returned underground, with the discipline of a man learning to fast. The secret room tolerated me. The book tolerated me. I read the section I had avoided. The Oath for Custodians of Amnesia, it was called, written in a Latin which had outlived empire by paying its taxes early. The phrases were exact and slow. We bind ourselves to the keeping of edges. We bind ourselves to the narrowing of hours where necessary. We bind ourselves to the removal of wings, where flight would undo the work of belonging. It asks signatories to imagine themselves wingless in order to walk the city's perimeter, which is not a wall but a weather. I thought then of all the parishioners I had asked to stay. Stay in the marriage for one more season. Stay with the illness until it teaches you its small grammar. Stay in the neighborhood even as the rents move like tides. I had preached belonging as a sacrament, with the confidence of a man who believed wings were for decoration. The room did not accuse me. It gave me the luxury of accusing myself. I do not know when the decision made itself, but by the time I heard footsteps in the corridor, the archivist, another librarian, with the soft gait of a person who has negotiated peace with her shoes, I had placed my hand on the page where the signatories gathered and pressed my finger lightly to the margin, as if to see whether the ink was still capable of telling the truth about heat. It was. The margin blurred under the pressure, and when I lifted my finger, a print remained as if my body had wanted to declare itself present in case anyone questioned me later. I buckled the case. I waited for the room to pull itself back into the wall. I stood in the corridor and listened to the 1,000 barely audible administrations of an archive. The way paper settles. The way leather remembers humidity as a bygone cruelty. The way dust speaks in a dialect made entirely of patience. If you have cared for a dying person, you know that rooms learn a different breathing. The corridor breathed like that. At the stair, I paused and let the upper light rehearse its greeting on my face before I accepted it. The archivist was at the top step, a human punctuation mark at the end of a sentence the building had written. He opened his mouth, decided against whatever he had wanted to say, and closed it with professional elegance. "Be careful walking back," he said at last, as if warning me about a puddle. "The surface is uneven where the old hours show through." Back on the street, I tested his warning. He was right. Afternoon, which should have been an obedient employee, kept glancing at a second watch on an invisible wrist. I allowed it. I bought figs and ate them from the paper in which the vendor had wrapped 3 versions of his childhood. I stood under a dome and, as I had promised myself, looked down. The thin brass strip across the floor announced noon in a language anyone can learn if they are willing to kneel. I put my shoe on the coin in the stone hand and felt stupid and devout at the same time, which is a healthy combination if you can bear it. The coin was warmer than the stone should permit. I imagined the line from that coin to the obelisk, to the absent star, to the drawer numbered 31, to the book strapped and patient, to the ink that refused to dry, to the bell that had rung once. The line included me now, and that is what made me understand the next necessity. I could not carry the corridor alone. A city cannot be loved secretly. Secrets corrode love from the inside. Do not mistake me. I did not plan a pamphlet. I did not imagine myself heroic in a late-career scandal. I did not rehearse speeches for journalists who would find the sound of their own mouths more reliable than mine. I planned a confession that would avoid self-importance the way a monk avoids mirrors. I planned to say exactly this. I have seen where the hours are edited. I have read the minutes of angels who forfeited wings to teach us how to remain. I have held the hide of memory in my hands. I have heard a bell at an hour that does not exist. I do not know what to do with this except remember it and ask you to remember it with me. That is how a descent becomes a pilgrimage. Not when you visit holy places, but when you ask ordinary people to carry a portion of your seeing until their own seeing answers back. I left the corridor to the archivist and his diction. I left the city to its practiced noon. I took the key home and set it on the table where it refused to cool. That night, for the first time, the door did not open in my dreams. Instead, a different sound arrived. Pages turning in a room that was mine. When I rose, I found the desk's drawer slightly open. Inside, the scrap of paper with the promise had slid to the back as if it had tried to escape and changed its mind. On the scrap, beneath my handwriting, a second hand, finer, more decisive, had added 2 words. Ring once. I put my finger to the ink. It was dry. I do not yet know why the door preferred the note to the bell. I do not know why some instructions arrive disguised as reminders in someone else's hand. I only know the descent is complete. I am no longer a visitor to the shadow archive. I am a man whose hours have been introduced to their editors. Tomorrow I will tell you about the calendar knife and how a century can be shaved from the face of time so cleanly you mistake the blood for a blush. Tonight I will sit with the key until the metal learns to imitate the cool I cannot give it. And I will listen to the city as it hums itself to sleep, a lullaby arranged by those who cared enough to keep us from learning the sky's more dangerous songs. The first time I held the calendar knife, I did not realize what it was. It lay on a velvet pad like a modest instrument, its handle worn by hands that had practiced a serenity I no longer trusted. If you have never seen a knife designed to cut time, imagine a letter opener married to a surgeon's scalpel, too ceremonial to be purely medical, too pragmatic to be purely symbolic. Along its spine, tiny hatch marks marched like disciplined soldiers, each line a year, every 5th line a decade, every century engraved with a quiet flourish, as if even precision cannot resist a little vanity. The tag beneath it read, in a bureaucrat's hand, "Instrument for the correction of drift." I had been taught to love that word, correction, the way a driver loves the gentle pull the wheel gives when the road curves. Correction is care. Correction keeps us out of ditches. But on the reverse of the tag, someone had written a single sentence in a smaller, less obedient script. The knife does not correct, it persuades. I lifted the blade and felt that subtle warmth I had learned to fear, the warmth of objects that remember us. If you compress a century on paper, the ink does not complain. That thought returned as I touched the hilt. The corridor had shown me the ledgers, the drawers, the minutes of the Ordo Vigilans. Now it showed me the tool that translates meetings into the world. We imagine reforms as metaphysical agreements, men in robes, men with telescopes, men with monarchs' ears, but the world changes because someone's hands make a cut. Phantom time had sounded laughable to me when I first encountered it in the pamphlets of clever boys, an audacious claim that chunks of history had been invented or lost, that certain rulers had inserted themselves into centuries like thieves into crowds. And yet the folios downstairs had treated the notion not as scandal but as a method, not error, but strategy. The calendar knife made the hypothesis intimate. It asked me to consider how a city feels the subtraction of hours, where the light falls differently in a kitchen, where a prayer arrives with the faint wrongness of a guest at the right door an hour early. In a drawer labeled Civil Adjustments, Demonstration Pieces, I found small brass discs, each stamped with a date and a tiny notch along the rim. When I set them spinning, they hummed with a pitch that changed as they slowed, the way a choir shifts when it remembers a different tuning fork. Underneath, a card explained how municipal clocks could be trained, a subtle lag on the hour, a string of punctual days to build trust, then a leap the way a magician distracts with repetition before performing the single necessary trick. The populace must never feel mocked, the card instructed, only relieved. I have counseled relief. I know its seductions. Relief makes you grateful to the hand that loosens the knot, even if that hand tied it. The calendar knife was an instrument of relief, disguised as correction. It cut so that the sky would continue to appear polite. There were records of the Gregorian reform, of course, public documents framed with scholastic care, apologies to equinoxes deferred too long, the theatrical sadness we adopt when we admit an old mistake and ask the world to nod. But behind the glass lay drafts written in another tone, not apology, but choreography. Here a scribe mapped how feast days overlay star risings, like a parent throwing a blanket over a bird cage. There, a notary suggested that certain saints' days be moved to disguise the return of an ancient ritual the city still remembered with its ankles. "Move the feast," he wrote, "and the crowd will move its longing." Another folder contained an apparatus that looked like a schoolboy's toy. 2 gears, a small pendulum, a parchment dial. The label called it a catechism clock. Its purpose, to pace lessons, so that catechumens would associate doctrine with a particular rhythm of the body. Synchronize breath to creed, a note advised. The hour will carry the idea afterward, even when the words are forgotten. Salesmen learn such arts without libraries. Priests learn them with libraries and call them pastoral. I do not want to flatter myself with outrage. Outrage would be an absolution. What I felt was more like fidelity growing teeth. Had I not praised the reform of calendars to classrooms? Had I not praised order as love made visible? The knife asked me whether I had praised a sculpture without noticing the chisels. It asked me whether my reverence had benefited from someone else's edits performed in hours that do not appear on the public clock. On a separate table, under cloth that pretended to be pious, modesty, and succeeded only at sounding tired, lay a box of proofs, woodcuts, pamphlet pages, marginalia, critiqued by a hand that loved to say no elegantly. One woodcut showed Street Peter's meridian line as a sword on the floor, the brass disc a coin ready to pay for silence. In the corner, a figure, part astronomer, part priest, knelt with a device, measuring how much the city could tolerate truth. In the next panel, the same figure adjusted a bell's schedule to mask the measurement's implications. "Let the hour carry mercy," the caption read. "The truth will keep its dignity by being late." It's the Rue Vade, a locked folio, bothered open with the archivist's key after a pause that felt like prayer, collected testimonies from towns across Europe, reports of days that seemed to end early, of markets that erupted like laughter in the wrong place on the clock, of weddings that started on time and ended feeling fugitive. And again the phrase, penned by many hands in many inks, as if the world were rehearsing a single line for a chorus. No one complained. They were grateful the bells remembered for them. Gratitude is an instrument. It can be played. At the bottom of the folio, folded into a pocket like a forgiveness, I found a letter from a woman who ran a bakery near one of the great churches. Her words were plain. She did not care about the sky. She cared about what the day did inside dough. When the bells moved, she wrote, the loaves lost their courage. We adjusted again. Now the bread is good, but I am suspicious of it. I closed my eyes and pictured her hands learning new patience. I opened them and realized why the Ordo Vigilans mapped which foods thickened time. Bread, like calendars, is a contract with heat. Do not think all this was accomplished by diktat and steel. The church did not need a tyrant to move the hours. It needed a pageant. In another drawer, festivals and harmonizations, a plan showed how processions could be tuned to persuade the body to accept a shift. Incense at a particular interval. Hymns with tempos that marched bodies into a new agreement with the sun. Relics lifted when shadows reached the festival's preferred length. Call it tradition, the plan suggested. Tradition is a beautiful name for choreography that has successfully hidden its knife. In the corridor's edgelight, a gilded globe sat sulking on a stand. When I pressed a finger to its equatorial band, the sphere clicked and revealed a recess. Inside, a tiny knife, a child of the calendar blade, slept on satin. For parish use, the card smirked. I thought of parish priests who adjusted their own mass times to match harvests, how they were praised for pastoral sensitivity, how the world smiles when clocks and crops finally agree. A parish priest does what the city asks, makes the hour easier to love. The knife promised convenience. Convenience is a narcotic. Administered with kindness, it is almost a sacrament. And then, on a stand that pretended to be unimportant, a leather folder held what frightened me most: translations of persons. We had seen the protocols, how to remove saints gently. Here were case studies. Agnes of the Bridge, once patron of travelers between two districts, a minor saint with a narrow geography and a poor cult. Her feast began to attract unwanted songs, old melodies that made neighbors remember a market erased to widen a boulevard. Solution: fold Agnes into the shade of a grander Agnes, move two statues, adjust hymns, reassign a ribbon of sky. The people protested for 3 weeks, the report recorded. They learned to bring flowers without names. After a year, they told their children a different story about the bridge. That is how forgetting works when it is curated. It is not violence. It is a demonstration. Another case, Hieronymus the Adjuster, an inventor whose devices kept city clocks honest. In the public catechism, he became Jerome the Patient, patron of those who accept delay without anger. Virtue retitled. The margin joked. His gears were moved to the sacristy and blessed as if they had volunteered. I had always loved the cunning of hagiographers, their ability to rescue lives for meaning. Now I saw how meaning comes with a receipt. I stepped back from the tables and felt the corridor shift, the way a boat shifts when a passenger moves from port to starboard. I was heavy with procedures. I needed weather. I needed the kind of sky even edited calendars cannot own. I climbed to the surface and let the day touch my face with the humility of winter light rehearsing for summer. The clocks in the piazza argued a little, as they always do in real cities, where accuracy is a courtesy and not a religion. Pigeons considered parliaments and adjourned. Under a dome, tourists obediently took pictures of a line in the floor whose purpose they did not ask. A man explained to his daughter that the bronze disc marked something to do with noon. She nodded with the seriousness children use to forgive their parents. I put my shoe on the coin again and felt the faint warmth that had no business being there. The coin held the day's pulse like a wrist. I wanted to hate all of it. I wanted to raise a banner against edit and knife and coin, but hatred would simplify what had been done in the name of a complicated mercy. So I stood and allowed myself a more dangerous feeling, comprehension. I comprehended what it cost to curate a civilization. The lies told to protect tenderness, the trims made to preserve a choir, the small humiliations meted out to skies that prefer to be wild. And I comprehended, too, the price. A populace that forgets how to ask the hour for itself, a faith that confuses choreography with holiness, a priest who cannot tell whether his voice belongs to him or to the metronome. Back in the corridor, the archivist who had the gift of arriving with the exact weight of presence a room could bear, stood beside the table of proofs. He touched none of them. "You have found the knife," he said, as if he had set it there that morning. "We do not display it on tours." "Why call it a correction?" I asked. "Why not name the cut?" He smiled without uplifting anything. "Because the world prefers to be consoled by language before it is cut by reality." He looked at my hands, at the dust that dowered them. "You have been cut. It suits you." I did not ask whether he had bled. I did not ask whether the Ordo Vigilans had kept their own hours intact while moving ours. The corridor teaches another politeness. Questions whose answers will merely shift your anger into a shape that flatters you are impolite. I asked instead a question that still embarrasses me for its simplicity. Is it reversible? The archivist considered the knife the way a physician studies an old scar. "Time forgives," he said carefully. "It does not restore. If you lift the cut pieces and press them back where they came from, the world will treat the seam like a superstition. Even miracles fail when the audience has lost its appetite. Better to teach them to want the truth again than to give it back unsalted." "How?" I said, and heard in my voice the hunger of a man who has wandered too long along the edges of curated rooms. "By asking them to listen," he said, "not to you, to the hour, to their own bodies, to bread, to shadows, to the ways the city's memory thins in some places and thickens in others. Ask them to place a shoe on a coin and notice the heat. Ask them to look up at a dome and then down at their hands. Ask them not to outsource their wonder." I wanted to be angry at the riddles, but his voice held neither smugness nor despair. It held the weariness of someone who had watched decades of calendar, knife, and festival salve, and still believed in a way that made tiredness a species of reverence. "And if they do not listen?" I asked. "Then the pact continues," he said, "and the bell will ring at an hour that does not exist, and those who can hear will always be few. But fewness is not a sin." I left him and returned to the secret room where the Demonhide Pact kept its pulse. I did not open it. I stood and allowed the smell of wax and iron to remind me that memory is a living animal with a temper. On the wall, someone had etched a sentence so faint that only men who had been awake too long could see it. I read it by leaning my head until the light decided to cooperate. We cut years to keep days from breaking. I said it aloud, because the mouth knows when a sentence will rule the mind unless it is spoken into air. For 3 days, I moved through the surface city as a student of seams. I discovered where the knife had been careless, a shadow that arrived too early and made a doorway nervous, a clock that hurried in spring as if ashamed of winter, a school bell that apologized with its second ring. I ate again at the bakery whose letter had made me love an unknown woman. I watched her hands knead the morning back into obedience. When she placed a loaf on the counter, she did not look at me, but the bread did, as loaves do when they believe they have understood a human. On the 4th day, the corridor allowed me a curiosity, a small theater, no larger than a sacristy, where a mechanical model demonstrated how phantom time can be inserted without causing a riot. Actors carved from wood merchants, a fishwife, a boy with a hoop walked around a square as a clock ticked. On the first pass, the clock struck 12. The actors paused and crossed themselves. A priest lifted a hand. A shadow on the square's painted wall fell where it should. On the second, the mechanism introduced a fractional lag to the clock. The actors moved the same way, but their pause came a breath later. The shadow fell slightly wrong. On the third, the mechanism corrected itself. But now the priest's gesture was a hair anticipatory. As if he had learned to be early, the model went on. Lag, correction, tiny leap, festival, procession, hymn, bread, sleep. At the end, the priest stood under a sky he had successfully domesticated, his hand frozen into the gesture of a man who has learned to bless quickly. The plaque beneath the model was merciless. After several seasons, the populace described the sky as trustworthy. I felt more than thought. That trustworthiness acquired that way is another kind of knife. When I told you earlier that silence was enforced, I meant it as metaphor and fact. Now I add, time is managed, not only by the predictable tyrannies of work and debt and aging, but by institutions that fear what the unorganized hour will ask of them. An unorganized hour is an invitation to comparison. A populace skilled at comparison is immune to certain spells. The calendar knife is not a weapon of tyranny. It is an inoculation administered in good faith by hands that believe chaos is a greater sin than condescension. On the 5th evening, while the corridor exhaled the day's dust and reset its patience for tomorrow's visitations, I took a notebook from my pocket and began a list not of accusations, but of instructions to my later self, who would accuse me of exaggeration. Find clocks that disagree and sit between them until your body chooses. Learn when bread betrays its baker. Watch where shadows hesitate. Place your shoe on the coin, and keep it there until the cool returns. Count the breath between bell and heartbeat. Refuse to outsource your hour. I wrote until the page refused more ink. Then the bell rang once, and the corridor's light went a degree grayer. The knife seemed to lengthen not physically, but in implication, until it stretched from the velvet pad to somewhere under my sternum. I realized, with that tired clarity you only earn by resisting obviousness, that the bell was not only a summons, it was a test of appetite. How much of the uncurated hour could I swallow without mistaking it for poison? How much of the crowd's relief had I been enjoying my whole life like a child enjoys a lullaby he will later resent? I closed my eyes and listened for something that was not a bell. Footsteps above, the long patience of stone, the city's throat clearing, as it prepared to sing the night into being. When I opened them, the archivist was standing in the doorway of the little theater, with the mechanical populace paused mid-gesture. "You have enough for a sermon," he said dryly. "Try not to preach it." "What should I do instead?" I asked, and heard how plaintive I sounded. "Document," he said. "Confess. Teach them to listen before you teach them to believe you. If you preach, they will applaud politely and go home grateful that somebody else is brave. If you confess, they may find themselves implicated while they butter their bread." He gestured toward the knife. "And do not sanctify tools. Tools are cowards. They only do what hands make them do." It is side. I thought of the hands that had cut centuries into shapes that would not frighten markets or weddings or the delicate confidence of cities. I thought of the hands that had painted over wings. I thought of my own hands, which had learned to lift a host, to close a door, to keep notes that a later self would read and accuse. "I will confess," I said. "That," he replied, "is how we begin to return the hours to those who own them." When I left that night, the sky was clear in the way only edited skies are, one cloud scolded into staying thin, the moon rehearsing a role it had not auditioned for. I walked past a clock that pretended to be correct, and a watch shop that pretended to sell certainty, and a bar where young men pretended to own mornings. I allowed the city its theater. I forgave it for having taught me to love punctuality before truth. At the apartment, I set the key on the table and did not touch it. I laid the calendar knife's image flat in my mind and told it, with the new courtesy I reserve for instruments, that I would not be using it. In the quiet, the bell of an ordinary tram announced its practical affection for intersections. 2 notes, cheerful, obedient. I smiled like a man who has learned to distinguish between a ritual and a habit. Tomorrow, I would talk to you about the Wingless Angels, not as a metaphor, but as a workforce. I would tell you how they learned to make marginalia into law. I would tell you how they lost, not in battle, but in print. But tonight, as the hour loosened its vest and sat down beside me, I would practice the most radical discipline I know. I would let the day end when it decided to, without asking the bell for permission. They were not metaphors when I finally faced them in the paper they left behind. They were a workforce, a grammar, a discipline. They called themselves, humbly and with a touch of stubborn humor, the Ordo Vigilans, the Order of the Watchful. Though the transcripts never allow you the romance of a uniform, they dressed like anyone who needed to pass unnoticed through a city that had learned to fear people who kept notebooks. What I had called angels were administrators of memory and its weather. They did not live in towers. They kept rooms above bakeries and cellars under schools, and they walked the same pavements that children chalked with hopscotch grids, only to have rain perform its quiet revisions. Their minutes filled a folio the color of late daylight, each page recording not doctrine, but decisions. Where to thicken an hour, whom to spare from the cut, which festival to move one street north so that its echo would seal a leak in the city's recollection. The first entry I read refused mythology. Meeting convened in the West Annex. Subject: removal of wings from street Mena depiction in the Chapel of the Ironworkers. There followed a conversation more practical than scandalous. The painter had rendered flight so convincingly that parishioners had begun to pray for departure rather than steadfastness. The foreman of the smiths came to complain about apprentices who, at vespers, stared upward as if weighing themselves for air. The order debated. Remove the wings. Keep the halo. Strengthen the hands. Give weight the dignity of miracle, the secretary recorded, a sentence that struck me the way a bell strikes bone. It was not hatred of heaven. It was fear of comparison. Wings imply elsewhere, and elsewhere invites measurements that injure the love of streets you can sweep. The Ordo Vigilans loved streets. They loved them so much they tried to train paintings to keep bodies close to cobblestones. In their minutes, the technical language of pigments joins a theology of posture. Feather detail draws hunger, varnish to dim, a male voice suggests. A woman's hand proposes. Keep the eyes forward, not above. Teach presence without punishing wonder. They were not trying to arrest imagination. They were trying to prevent emigration. I read on and found their cartography. The myth had said corridors of memory, as if poets had gotten drunk on metaphors. The maps were sober. On onion-skin paper, layered like the strata of a city, the Ordo sketched routes beneath Europe. Cloisters that opened onto aqueducts, crypts that tunneled into forgotten Roman basements, culverts that had learned the patience of monks. Along those routes, notches marked where remembering had grown thin suburbs with new names, plague cemeteries whose dead were no longer visited, markets paved over for parades. Beside each notch, a proposed cure. A procession here, a reliquary there, a string of lamps along a river timed to anchor dusk. They did not pray to defeat oblivion. They treated it as weather and built levees. A minute from a city I will not name described how the Order discovered a seam under a square routinely used for military reviews. During parades, people forgot themselves too quickly. The spectacle smoothed edges that needed friction to carry memory across generations. The solution was not protest. It was choreography. The Ordo placed an annual Saints' Day on the square 2 weeks before the parade, taught the choir an older meter, and made the children's procession take a route that paused under balconies where grandparents watched. We reintroduce the elders into the square's memory, the secretary wrote, as if a plaza were a book with lovers' names carved into its margins. Not all entries were gentle. In the folder labeled Translations, Persons, that ruthless euphemism, you could feel the temperature drop. A boy saint from a riverside chapel had begun to collect unregulated miracles. Sudden recoveries, unblessed gatherings of mothers at dusk, a rumor that the statue wept when the moon was exactly there and the tide exactly so. The Order judged the cult unstable. The minutes list the steps with the same care a physician reserves for a painful procedure. Move the statue across the river, repaint the eyes to be dry, rename the vigil Family Hour. Fold the boy into the patronage of a safer saint with better infrastructure. We forfeit wings to walk among them. The oath returns, not as poetry, but as a receipt. It is difficult to read without feeling the threshold under your foot flex into something like betrayal. I made a note on my own paper, the cheap kind that drinks ink greedily, that I would not treat the Order as villains. Villains make stories efficient. The truth of cities is allergic to efficiency. These were intelligent, devout, occasionally ferocious people who had seen what happens when memory runs without canal or sluice. Pogroms. Crusades that remember their songs more tenderly than their victims. Crowds that mistake sorrow for permission. They chose management because they feared weather. We curate to minimize flood. One marginal hand insists in a script so controlled it almost apologizes for existing. The folder labeled The Wing Removal Program, the archivist's irony, not theirs, included case studies arranged like catechism answers. Q. What is the pastoral argument for diminishing wings? A. Weight is a sacrament. Teach bodies to trust ground. Q. Will we not be accused of heresy? A. We will be accused of taste. Painters were given stipends to correct old frescoes. The order drafted letters to bishops with a tone I recognized from administrative life, loyal, persuasive, not fully candid, in the interest of unifying iconography with local catechesis, they wrote, and the brush did its mercies. At the end of one set of reports lay a small envelope sealed with wax the color of sermons. Inside, a single feather gold leaf pressed onto vellum had its shaft crossed by a hair of ink, the sigil I had begun to see everywhere, a blade interrupting a wing. On the envelope's flap, a line that refused metaphor and therefore approached holiness. We keep the halo so the light remains findable. It is easier to forgive people who write like that. It is harder, too, because your anger has fewer places to live. The order kept tutors who taught them how to argue with art without killing it. One manual, for parish painters and carvers, on the dignity of hands, instructed artisans to lengthen forearms, to deepen tendons, to let the light find knuckles. Hands carry more doctrine than wings when bread is scarce, the manual says. And under that, in the same careful hand, if you must remove flight, increase touch. To this day, I cannot enter a church without seeing hands that once replaced feathers. They also trained parish priests. A syllabus, dry as chalk, reconstructed homilies with verbs that carried weight. Remain, bear, attend, bless, mend, lift. The verbs we associate with wings ascend, escape, survey, were not forbidden. They were quarantined to scripture readings, where the order trusted tradition to fence them. Teach assent as humility, the notes advise, and the air will stop smelling like permission. I had used these verbs faithfully. I had thought them piety. The syllabus made me feel drafted after the fact. The Ordo's minutes sometimes bloom, unexpectedly, into the literature of small defeats. In one city, a fresco painter refused to diminish wings on the archangel. He argued not with theology, but with grief that he had lost a son to fever and needed to paint flight so as not to hate the earth. The order relented. The fresco remained. Exception recorded, the clerk wrote, then in a softer hand beneath. A mercy unrelated to policy is still a policy's undoing. These are the sentences that keep me from hating them. They knew the cost of making rules and still loved the rule breakers more than their own elegance. From the Ordo Vigilans I learned the liturgy of marginalia, the battle that happens in the gutter of the page where power thinks it is safe. In a ledger of saints slated for translation, beside each red name a coordinate cluster, weighted latitude and longitude, for the last place that name still had a body's warmth attached to it. A corner where a mother whispered a plea, a step where an old man touched stone without knowing why. A patch of shadow that arrived at 4 in the afternoon and consoled people who did not believe. Field agents walked those coordinates at the appointed hour and listened. That was their first sacrament, hearing what the city already knew. If the warmth persisted, the saint survived the meeting. If the warmth had fled, the translation began. The method is terrible because it is accurate. You might expect me to say the order lost a war to men with bigger knives. They did not. They lost by seduction by their own excellence. They became so good at balancing memory against weather that patrons stopped believing balance required work. When the knife cut centuries, no one expected the Ordo to protest because the bread was good and the bells announced mercy even when they disguised edits. Renowned domesticated vigilance. Respect is a solvent, one exhausted entry sighs. Soon we will all be consulted, and none of us heard. They did, however, fight, not with swords, but with annotations. I kept saying that to myself in the corridor, like a catechism taught to a child with a suspicious imagination. They fought with annotations. In one riot of correspondence, Jesuits debated Rosicrucians about which hour could carry a realignment without inviting heresy. Map guilds argued with choirmasters about whether a hymn could be tuned to cover a leap day's insertion. In the margins, tiny battles won and lost with pencil and patience. You can see sentences revised to conceal victory under the modesty of compromise. The Holy War's battlefield was paper. The casualties were names. What stripped the angels' wings finally was not an edict. It was an economy of attention. Citizens learned to love paintings that did not ask too much of their necks. Parishioners, exhausted by plagues and wars and prices and the new, quickening cruelty of machines, wanted hands they could imitate more than feathers they could envy. The order obliged. The wings, scraped or painted thin, followed the appetite. In 3 decades you can track, through invoices for gesso and gilding, how much gold leaf migrated from feathers to halos. We were not conquered, a late minute insists. We adjusted until adjustment defined us. The oath appears throughout their papers like a refrain. You begin to hum before you realize you know the tune. We forfeit wings to walk among them. We forfeit names to recall theirs. When I first read it, I treated it as a beautiful sentence. By the 10th repetition, I heard the fatigue under the beauty. A people choosing to be unthanked so that afternoons would keep their shape. A page I cannot revisit without a complicated reverence records the quiet ceremony by which new members accepted their forfeiture. No candles, no relics, a table, bread, a knife, a map. Place your palm on the city, the presider says in words the secretary recorded without adornment. Vow to stay. When you want to become light, stay. When you want to leave, stay. You will be forgotten correctly. It's one sight. In the secret room that housed the Demonhide Pact, a smaller case held the Ordo's tools. Chalks in colors no child would choose. A string for measuring shadow drift. A bell tuned to a note that calms dogs. There was also an instrument I could not at first name. A small compass whose needle did not point north but toward the nearest place where a story had just been told. Narrative finder, the card said, as if that were an ordinary phrase. The Ordo used it to locate where to anchor processions and pageants, places where language had recently warmed air, so that ritual would not have to start from cold. I lifted the tool, and the needle quivered toward a corner of the corridor where a junior archivist was whispering to a creaking shelf as if apologizing for the weight of a dictionary. I put it down gently. Some devices make you aware of your own manners. Outside the paperwork, the order left only a few marks on stone. If you stand in certain alleys after rain, you can see, low on the wall, small chisels in the shape of feathers that were once instructions for a night procession's lantern-bearers. Follow them, and you arrive at a square that never learned to love even numbers. In certain churches, Run your fingers along the base of a statue and find a shallow groove where people once slid folded papers and the order's runners came to collect them at dawn. These are not miracles. They are proof that memory uses infrastructure. It is natural, at this point, to ask who erased the order from the stories we tell ourselves. The answer in the minutes is unsatisfying, because it is true, mostly, they erased themselves. They hid in the glare of usefulness. They let bishops claim credit for their choreography. They allowed sculptors to sign the hands they had specified. They permitted parishes to tell the legend of a miracle, where they had merely retimed a bell. And when they were accused rarely of managing more than they should, they accepted the accusation as a compliment and wrote another manual. Theft of credit preserves the work, one line insists. We trained our vanity to kneel. But there were also enemies, a coalition I can only call the mild absolutists, men who wanted doctrine to be frictionless, petitioned to end the order's influence. Their letters are filled with that certain cleanliness which is not holiness but a preference for sterile surfaces. Trust grace, not choreography, they wrote, with a piety so efficient it makes you wince. In the reply, the Ordo wrote what I now count among the great late sentences of Christian literature. Grace is not an alibi for negligence. They lost the vote anyway. Budgets shrank, fewer stipends for painters. The shadow survey downscaled. The narrative finder sat in a drawer long enough to forget what it was seeking. I closed the folio and sat there with my hands, those new sacraments, useless on my knees. The corridor felt like a church emptied after a funeral, when flowers still pretend it is a wedding. The archivist arrived as he does, soundless as an edit. He set down a small bundle of postcards, reproductions of paintings before and after the wing adjustments, and left without instructing me how to feel. I spread the cards. Before, feathers extravagant, eyes tipped upward, sandals that promise a step away. After, hands as deliberate as verbs, eyes that meet you without punishing you for being on the ground, sandals that look worn. The before is glorious. The after is bearable. I did not know which to prefer, and that ignorance felt like a kind of graduation. I did not weep. Men like me do not weep in archives. We leak politely. What overcame me was not sorrow, but a recognition that the Ordo had been my teachers long before I knew they existed. I had told couples to remain, told mourners to keep watch, told children to bless the room they were in before longing for a better one. I had preached hands without feathers. I had been, without the uniform, one of them. This is the shape shame takes when it grows up, gratitude dressed as complicity. I turned again to the oath, because ritual compels return. We forfeit wings to walk among them. I imagined the ceremony. No candles, I told you, only a map. I placed my palm on the city, as the oath required. Paper warmed, a ridiculous superstition, perhaps. Or perhaps paper remembers better than we do. I whispered the second line, the one that hurts reputations. We forfeit names to recall theirs. Names are ecclesiastical currency. I had saved mine like a careful clerk. In the corridor's gray, my name felt heavier than the keys. The Wingless Angels taught another discipline I have not seen recorded elsewhere. The art of undramatic repair. A section of their manual lists repairs that should never be noticed. A stone reset flush with the nave so a pallbearer does not trip. A street lamp adjusted 10 minutes earlier on winter days. so the school children learn to think of dusk as something the city meets halfway. A bakery's door rehung so the bell above it rings on an inhalation, not an exhalation, persuading buyers they are arriving rather than leaving. Repair without applause, the margin repeats. Applause attracts editors. I laughed aloud there in the corridor, the sound inappropriate and therefore necessary. You want an enemy you can indict. The Order refuses you that satisfaction. They were the editors of an anthology called We Keep You Here, and most days the book is precious. On some days it is a cage. The bell that rings at the 13th hour, that moment of unofficial time, was their emergency measure for admitting weather when management had made the air stale. Sound once, a page instructs, to alert the faithful that reality is about to exceed choreography. Sound twice to consent to its entry. I have heard once. I fear and desire the twice. In the lower right corner of the last page, I allowed myself, someone with a pen that did not want to be dramatic, drew wings small enough to hide behind a thumbnail. They were not attached to a body. They were not even attached to each other. Two small signs of permission, drawn by a person who had spent a life teaching people to want less of it. Under them, in a cramped script that made privacy a verb, a final note. When the sky is kind, all wings are borrowed. I closed the book and felt, not absolution, but the habit of it, a rhythm the hands learn in rooms where devotion earns no plaque. When I returned to the surface, the day was practicing generosity. Sunlight balanced on the stone like a liturgy that had decided not to insist. At a corner, an old woman carried bread under her arm the way one carries a small, sleeping animal. At a crossing, a boy hesitated until a man extended a hand. The boy took it without ceremony. These are the miracles the Ordo lived to protect. These are the hours that do not survive. Grand theories. I stood under a painted angel whose feathers had been sanded thin and felt no resentment. The painter had lengthened the fingers and taught the wrist a blessing that did not require air. I touched the stone where a note would once have been slid to a runner with good shoes. I said, because confession is a muscle that grows with use. I am grateful and alarmed. I am the product of choreography that spared me storms and stole a wing I might have used to look over the wall. I am standing, and that is not small. If you require a villain to go on, take me. I wore the collar and loved the careful knife. I blessed the adjusted bell and called it mercy. I taught assent as humility and never asked who paid for the metaphor. The Ordo has already forgiven me. That is another of their bad habits. They forgive toward the future while making the present navigable. They forgive so the city will accept bread as a theology tested on taste buds, not on theses. They forgive so that a man who has seen the ledger of names written in red can still sleep inside a day that smells of soap. In the apartment that evening, I set my palm on the map again and waited for nothing to happen. Nothing, obedient and kind, arrived. I wrote on a slip of paper, "This is how I pray." Now 2 sentences for the next hour. Bless hands before wings. Listen for the bell that has permission to be late. Then I folded the paper and placed it under the key, which had cooled at last as if it had learned a new discipline from the map. Tomorrow, the pact. The ledger called Pactum Chorii Daemonis has been patient with me. It will not be patient forever. The Wingless Angels took vows I can admire and fail to imitate. The pact wrote contracts I can barely bring myself to speak aloud. If the Ordo is a confession, The pact is a signature, and signatures, more than sermons, are what bind cities to the weather they deserve. I had delayed the pact because contracts are harder to forgive than sermons. A sermon can be repented of in the next homily, rewritten by a new season's parable. A contract survives the moods of its authors. It keeps time when the clock breaks. The case was waiting on its stand with the patience of a bed in a hospital, indifferent to who lies upon it, precise about the work to be done. When I opened the strap, the room lost a degree of temperature, not a dramatic chill. Nothing theatrical ever happens here, but the practical subtraction a tailor makes when a jacket must fit truth. The title page had learned stateliness from law. Pactum coriae daemonis. The ink did not glisten. It had settled into the page the way a conviction settles into a face. They did not mean demon in the way parishioners whisper over candles, looking for a loophole. They meant memoria as a creature with patience and appetite, older than liturgy, older than the confidence of calendars, a living capacity that can turn on its keepers when crowded. The pact was an agreement between the church represented by men and a few women whose names had been sharpened into signatures, and the animal we all carry that refuses to forget without payment. The hide, they believed, bound the terms to a skin that could be taught restraint. The opening clauses are a catechism written by administrators. The city requires protection from the unpaced return of what it once knew. The faith requires insulation from curiosities that behave like claims. The people require relief from comparison. The phrases offended me and relieved me in the same breath. I have preached insulation as pastoral care. I have prayed for relief when comparison made love difficult. I have used the word protection like a lullaby. Then the ledger of signatures, astronomer priests whose instruments had confessed under oath, abbesses whose laboratories had made a peace treaty with yeast, a cartographer whose maps refused to hold lies, smearing them into weather, an archbishop too intelligent to be liked, a guildmaster of bell founders, a choir director who could tune a procession to cross a square without waking the rats, two secular magistrates who wrote the honest sentences all pacts need when the faithful get too eloquent, and, in a column set off by a border of stylized feathers, the sign of the Ordo Vigilans. Not names were their first forfeiture, but the crossed feather, the blade a hair gentler than before. The terms, custodianship. The Church will assume custody of all artifacts, texts, maps, devices, chants, and techniques that measurably thicken time. These shall be catalogued under sacramental pretexts and distributed through rituals, festivals, calendars, and pageantry designed to domesticate their effects. Curation. In exchange for custody, Memoria will recede from the streets at dangerous hours, withdrawing the floods of return that bristle crowds into panics and purities. The receding is to be measured by bread, sleep, and the laughter of children. If any fails, the pact is in breach. Adjustment. Calendars may be corrected by small cuts, publicly justified as astronomy, privately engineered as choreography to misalign the populace from star risings that wake ancestral appetites. No cut will be called a cut. The knife must carry mercy in its handle. Translation. Saints, myths, and names that agitate the civic temperature shall be translated administratively, their patronage reassigned, their wings diminished, their feast days moved to corridors of memory in need of plaster. No translation will be called an erasure. All erasures must acquire a pastoral tone. Emergency. When the flood returns, and it will, the bell shall be rung at the 13th hour, once to warn, twice to permit. Those who hear will not be punished for remembering aloud. Those who do not hear will be protected by choreography. Audit. The pact shall be audited by the unlikeliest witnesses available: bakers, undertakers, midwives, and bell founders. If bread loses courage, if graves grow talkative, if births arrive at hours unrecognized by clocks, if bells crack in their throats, the audit fails, and amendments must be read to the city disguised as blessings. Under the terms, an oath for the keepers. It did not promise glory. It promised boredom, accuracy, discretion, and a palate for quiet humiliations. We will draw curtains for the sake of sleep, it read, and open them at hours we cannot publish. We will be thanked incorrectly. We will be blamed accurately. We will let them think. Providence likes schedules. I turned pages, greedily, and then ashamed of my greed. The middle sections documented decades of maintenance. Examples of cuts that drew no blood because citizens called them convenience. Transliterations of myths into safer stories that preserved virtue without the messy insistences of wonder. Lists of festivals tuned to hide leaps in the calendar, the way a cough hides the throat's rebellion at a funeral. It was all as reasonable as earlier rooms had promised. It was also coercion, performed with velvet gloves and a polished vocabulary. Then the breaches. The paper here had gone brittle with frequent reading. The script grew agitated, posture tightening as the lines remembered who they were dealing with. Anno, redacted. A choir boy in the quarter of the locksmiths hummed an old star song in an alley. 3 street lamps shivered. 2 pigeons attempted to land and change their minds in midair. A statue by the fountain lifted a hand and lowered it, as if the blessing had learned doubt. The boy was found and asked kindly to forget the tune. He refused kindly. The song was placed onto a procession the following week and given a hymn's words. The city forgave the alley by singing elsewhere. Anno, redacted. A printer guild, mischievous, set the market calendar 1 day ahead for a joke. The bread failed at dawn. Lovers met under a sky that had not yet agreed to be tender. A funeral arrived before the death. The guild was fined. The processions were doubled. The bells apologized. Anno, redacted, a Jesuit teaching optics, showed children the sky's movement with a lens that refused to flatter. Their parents returned with questions shaped like hope. The lens was purchased by a cathedral and placed under glass. The Jesuit received a stipend to write about mercy. He wrote beautifully. The lens gathered dust, honorably. The enemy wasn't malice, it was curiosity with good posture. The pact did not outlaw it. It accommodated until accommodation became the atmosphere and appetite dulled. When accommodation failed, the audit clause groaned like old wood. Reports from undertakers who could feel when the hours were stitched badly into corpses' faces, from midwives whose hands knew when time had been adjusted and therefore labor refused to cooperate, from bell founders whose ears heard a 13th overtone born in the bronze, a ghost note that ruined the honest ring. Memoria was not a monster. It was a choir too large for one conductor. In a side pocket contracts keep their worst truths. In pockets was a memorandum labeled, "On the Forgotten War." I read it, standing up. Some documents require the spine to share the work. It was not a war of armies. It was an index war. Catalogs fought, catalogs Jesuit inventories against Rosicrucian glossaries, university syllabi against parish lectionaries, guild notebooks against the whispered curricula of midwives and carpenters. Each side kept hours, each hour rearranged loyalties. At night, annotations crossed the margins like soldiers crossing rivers. In the morning, electric sunlight made everyone polite. The minutes of a crisis meeting recorded the pact's nearest collapse. A city, its name scratched into anonymity, with the care only lovers give to privacy, flickered between two versions of itself for 3 days. A bridge woke up, as wood after a century of stone. A saint returned to her old patronage in dreams. The clock tower rang a number of times, no schoolchildren recognized. The Ordo Vigilans argued for letting the flicker continue. "Memory is building a case," one wrote, "and we are clerks, not judges." The pact's senior keeper disagreed. "Children need school on Monday," he said. The bell was rung at the 13th hour. Once. The city steadied like a drunk deciding to love water. There was a vote to ring twice, and it failed, by the thickness of a finger. At the bottom of the page, a note in a hand I had begun to love for its disobedient neatness. Save twice for when mercy requires astonishment. The script placed a dot of ink that could have been a tear or discipline. No one will know which. I closed the memorandum and found beneath it a document with edges burned. The archivist's penciled apology in the corner rescued from a kiln made me love him for the first time. The document was the pact's rationale, written to a future that might no longer want such guardians. It admitted everything that a tribunal would demand and then insisted upon something no tribunal can hear. That management had been love's clumsy answer to weather, that the Ordo had chosen to be forgotten not because they worshipped obscurity, but because the city worshipped itself into panic without caretakers. I wanted to refuse them, to return the book to its case like a priest slamming a confessional grate. But below the rationale lay a page that ended my anger by exceeding it. It was a litany of costs, the kind a treasurer compiles when budgets become ethics. We lost flight in images so the poor would not hate the ground. We taught bells to lie slowly so markets could tell the truth. We mistranslated saints so daughters could walk home, unfrightened by the plural of miracle. We moved the equinox, a breath so bakers could forgive mornings. We drank blame for weather we did not command, because blame comforts like salt. After the costs, a column of confessions. We enjoyed the cleverness of our edits too much. We confused choreography with care. We accepted being thanked in place of being understood. We grew fluent in the tone of necessity and forgot how to speak gratitude in public. I had been part of this fluency. I have written necessity into homilies, then shaken hands at the door while people thanked me for confirming their fatigue. I have called consolation a virtue when it was merely anesthesia. The pact did not invent my weakness, it employed it. When I looked up, the room had narrowed with me. The walls of the little chamber within the corridor had advanced by the width of ink. The book lay like a patient animal that will not run even when untethered. Somewhere above, a cart rattled over stone. The sound descended as advice. Do not close a ledger until you have learned what your name weighs in it. There, in a section set aside for signatures of acknowledgement, not consent, not obedience, only receipt, I found a column of hands, not names, not titles, just prints left by fingers pressed into ink. Bakers' hands, with scars where heat had taught caution. Bell founders' hands, with bites from wire and mold. undertakers' hands, calm as closing eyes, midwives' hands, where the calendar had learned humility, and priests' hands are small ambitions worn smooth by piety stamped next to them. The caption, "Those who will be blamed and thanked in misdirected measure." I pressed my hand into the tray of ink, as if returning a book to circulation, and lowered it to the page. When I lifted it, a feather's shadow crossed the pad of my thumb where the campus of ridges meets the line that predicts the heart. I was not alone. The archivist, who moves like a continuation of the furniture's conscience, was in the doorway. He did not ask what I had seen. "You are at the place," he said softly, "where confession meets administration. Is there a way to end it without ending us?" I asked, and felt the indecency of asking a man who had likely asked the same question 1,000 times until language bruised. "Pacts end," he said, "when the populace wants to hear the hour without instruments. Not a revolution, a practice. The difficulty is appetite." "And ringing twice?" I asked. He looked at the book as if it were an old friend with a bad habit. "Twice is not a solution. It is a permission. You cannot decide for a city that it will tolerate the uncurated hour. You can only refuse to protect it from that hour when the hour arrives for it." As if coached by his sentence, the corridor altered its articulation of light. Gray deepened. The dust suspended itself like a congregation at the intake of prayer. The bell rang. Once. I had felt it in my ribs before, but never like this, an accurate strike that left the air measuring itself. The ledger trembled, not from sound, but from recognition. In the larger archive above, footsteps hesitated and then resumed as if the body had agreed to believe it had misheard. The archivist looked toward the stair and then away, practiced in the discipline of letting the surface fend for itself. Another ring would let it in. I thought of the choir boy in the locksmith's quarter, of the bakery where loaves grew suspicious of their courage, of the lens purchased by a cathedral and made sterile by glass, of women who carry a city through contractions, while men adjust our hands, of bridges deciding which century to mimic, of paintings where hands learn to replace wings, of a city that steadied when the bell rang once, and a vote that failed by a finger's thickness to ring twice. The bell did not hurry me. Bells that know their work never do. I touched the book's strap and felt the warmth of the hide, restrained but confident. Contracts have that confidence. They assume that even doubters will honor them on busy days. The archivist said nothing. That was his ritual. I walked to the wall where, at a height designed for humility, a rope waited behind a modest swinging panel. No grand tower pull, only the tether to a small mechanism hidden like a tendon. I placed my hand on it and felt the faintest pulse. Metal expecting orders. The city above us, that good actor, continued its scene. A scooter coughed in the plaza. Somewhere a boy threw a ball wrong and learned physics. Somewhere a couple found a rhythm for their quarrel. Somewhere a priest buttered bread as if rehearsal could make Sunday happen safely. Once had warned. Twice would admit. I closed my eyes and said the names of people I have buried. I said the names of marriages I asked to remain for one more winter, and that winter was their last. I said the names of children baptized at hours the calendar had moved for convenience. I said the names of the Ordo's invisible hands. I said the names of people whose names I had learned to translate to keep other names safe. Each name thinned my appetite for grandeur. Each name lengthened my patience for ordinary days. not orchestrated to flatter my courage. I let go of the rope, not as a refusal, as a confession. I am not the one who gets to let the flood in. I am the one who has finally learned the difference between warning and permission. I am the one who has understood that the hour must choose its own audience. The bell did not ring twice. The archivist exhaled, not relief, exactly, but the air a man returns to the room when he has verified that it can still breathe without his intervention. He closed the book, as if closing a child's eyes for sleep. "There will come a day," he said, "when twice is mercy, not spectacle. If you are alive then, you will not need a rope. The city will pull." I wanted to argue, to declare that my restraint was wisdom and not fear. The book refused to flatter me. On the last page, a sentence I had missed because its humility is the camouflage of the true. The person who rings twice must be willing to be thanked incorrectly and blamed accurately for the rest of his natural life. I am not that person. Perhaps I never will be. Perhaps no one is until the hour chooses them by teaching their hand the weight of a rope. We left the small room, which returned to being a fragment of wall. The corridor received us with the unambitious patience of well-kept wood. I placed the pact back into its case and buckled the strap. The leather, whatever it was, held a lingering warmth, the memory of countless palms. I pressed mine to it, as one presses to a door one has not entered, and whispered, because training insists on benedictions, even for things that do not deserve them. Stay until we can hear ourselves. On the stairs we met a junior librarian with a stack of hymnals. She apologized for blocking the way, even though she was not blocking the way. People trained by curated hours apologize like that. I stepped aside and learned a small lesson. When you move before being asked, the room remembers your name more kindly. I wish the pact had written that. At the surface, the afternoon wore its respectable face. The clocks consented to agree. The pigeons pretended law. Children rehearsed the science of loudness. Under the dome, the brass disc waited for shoes. I placed mine upon it and allowed the coin to teach me patience by not warming at my command. It warmed when it did. I kept my foot where it belonged, on stone that had held its pose through many agreements, and I let the hour continue without a rope. That night, I did not pray to be forgiven for cowardice. Cowardice is neat and admirable. I prayed to be forgiven for the cleverness with which I had made necessity attractive. I wrote on a piece of paper, "This is how I sign now. Do not sanctify tools. Do not despise them either. Teach hunger for the uninstrumented hour." I folded the paper and left it under the key, which cooled like a patient whose fever is practicing how to depart. You want me to ring twice. You want the city to flicker into its other self, and for bridges to confess, and for statues to lift their hands, and for children to wake under the sky's true pace. So do I. But tonight is not for astonishment. Tonight is for the discipline of listening when once is enough. Sleep, then, under a bell that remembers mercy without permission. Tomorrow I will bring you to the wakeful hour, where the confession becomes a small torch I will refuse to carry alone. The city slept as if it had learned the trick of appearing innocent. Trams made their final bargains with intersections. Cafes stacked chairs like tired arguments. Clocks rehearsed their alibis for the morning. I sat with the key on the table, and the pact closed in its case beneath the stone. There is a way a room feels when paper has decided to stop being merely wood pulp and ink. It is not sanctity. It is gravity with manners. I had told you that I did not ring twice. If that registers as cowardice to you, hold the word gently until it becomes a practice instead of an accusation. A man does not become brave by adding bells to his biography. He becomes brave by refusing to outsource his listening. I had listened to indexes fight wars, to painters teach gravity, to bakers adjust dawn, to bells that lied kindly, to a city that let itself be curated because it wanted to be spared comparisons. I had said my small refusal to the rope. Now I had to say my larger yes to the hour. Morning found me with a plan that wasn't one. Plans belong to committees. What I had could barely be written. Walk. Listen. Ask for witnesses who do not want to be named. I put the paper in my pocket and left. A bakery first, because bread understands how to teach hours. The woman whose letter had made me love her competence stood at her counter with the intelligence of someone who has negotiated with heat long enough to know its jokes. I asked, too bluntly for politeness, how she knew when the day had been adjusted by someone who would never buy a loaf. The dough sulks, she said, not looking up. The proofing tells you a story that doesn't match the calendar. Then you stop listening to clocks, and you listen to bubbles. They refuse to lie. She slid a peel into the oven with the same tenderness I once reserved for Chrism. The city wants to be forgiven for being busy, she added. So do priests. He say. Next, a bell founder whose yard smelled of old fire and future metal. He held a tuneless cup of bronze in his hands as if it were a skull that had lost its biography. People ask for notes, he said. They want E or F or some holy interval their grandmother loved. I ask them what they need the bell to do to a square at noon. He tapped the bronze and listened. When the 13th overtone enters a bell, you know the calendar has been altered, he said, almost kindly. The metal remembers what the plaza refuses. An undertaker, sleeves rolled as if grief had a season. He spoke with the exactitude of a man who uses euphemisms only when the family requests the luxury. When hours are stitched badly into days, faces hold the wrong shadow, he said. Bodies know. They never learned politeness. He lifted a hand and stopped, the professional courtesy of not instructing me what to see. A midwife, hands speaking even when her mouth rested. We pretend births obey dates, she said, laughing without unkindness. What they obey is permission. When the city has mismanaged permission, labor becomes shy. Then we sing old songs to correct the clock, the way you correct a child's appetite with kindness that does not negotiate. She looked at my collar, or rather at the place where the collar used to be. You know this already, she said. You were trained to call it sacrament. None of them wanted their names recorded. I honored the refusal because anonymity is how some truths consent to be visible. I wrote instead their nouns: baker, founder, undertaker, midwife. I wrote their verbs: proof, tune, close, receive. I wrote the sentence that gathered them like a procession in a square. When the hour is mismanaged, the bodies that serve it become honest. I walked the city as if it were a book that had misplaced its ribbon. Where clocks disagreed, I sat on steps and placed my breath between them until my chest chose. Where a fresco's hands had learned to carry the doctrine once delegated to feathers, I held my own hands in that posture and waited to see what they remembered. Where the brass disc lay in the stone hand of the church, I stood with my shoe upon it until the heat arrived in its own time. Where a map pretended to be a floor, I followed the thin meridian line with the patience of an old pilgrim who knows shortcuts make you late to yourself. The city did not reward me with spectacle. Spectacle is what pacts use to bribe the imagination. The city offered instead a series of small permissions, a child counting wrong, and then right on a hopscotch grid chalked into a worn courtyard, a couple adjusting their quarrel to an honest tempo, an old woman testing her steps on a curb, and finding, to her surprise, that the curb had decided to remember her. These were not miracles. They were what happens when hours behave more like water and less like policy. At the archives, I kept my appointments with dust. I returned the postcards the archivist had left me to their box, and wrote a sentence I wished I had learned as a seminarian. Art is what happens when theology forgets to be afraid of touch. The archivist read the line over my shoulder and made a small noise that could have been agreement or the beginning of a cough. "You want to preach," he said without malice. "You must resist that appetite like gluttony." He placed a small leather folio on the table. "Confessional scripts," he explained, "from the years when memory ran too fast and we instructed priests how to slow it without making God look like a bureaucrat." He opened to a page. "Ask them what they remember that nobody else remembers," the script advised. "Tell them that forgetting is not a sin, but refusing to notice is." I copied it into my notebook and underlined it until the paper asked me to be polite. I have said, perhaps too often, that silence was enforced. Let me confess, a silence I enforced in others. The silence of consent. I told people to accept calendars the way they accept weather. I told them that obedience was identical to peace. I told them that questioning was a brittle luxury for people with paid rent. This is the place in the documentary where you expect a montage of regret. I will not give it. Regret turns into theater too quickly. I offer instead the inventory of what I can still carry without breaking. 1. I can carry the knowledge that pacts begin as love and end as habit, and that habit is what makes good men indifferent. 2. I can carry the discipline of counting breath between bell and heartbeat until the body learns to distrust the convenience of certain hours. 3. I can carry the promise to ask for witnesses whose professions are proof, not applause. 4. I can carry the instruction to read the city downward floors that are maps, coins that are clocks, domes that are instruments for gathering patience. 5. I can carry the refusal to sanctify tools and the equal refusal to despise them. The knife cuts calendars. The baker cuts loaves. Neither is holy, neither is profane. The holiness lies in what the cuts ask of us. When evening pulled its chair up to the table of the day, I went to a church where the 13th hour hides under fresco and stone. It is not a secret place. It sits in the open, entering photographs without consent. I waited until the official bells finished their rehearsal and the tourists rehearsed their sighs. Then I simply remained. Remaining is a skill we forget because it does not look like progress. Footsteps behind me. The archivist, though he had no right to be there at that hour. Perhaps rights are what good cities suspend for people who know how to be almost invisible. He stood beside me and said, "You could ring it. A statement, not a dare." "I won't," I said. "Not tonight." "The every breach, this end." He nodded, and the nod was an agreement with the hour, not with me. Then we ought to talk about how to give away what you have taken, he said. Confessions become hoarded treasures if you keep them in rooms. I am talking to them, I said, meaning you. The hour ate the pronoun without complaint. I am talking to anyone who will listen in the countries that love to call themselves modern. I will tell them a story they can use, like a small tool. How to place a shoe on a coin, how to notice a wrong shadow, how to forgive a bell with a crooked habit, how to ask a baker whether the dough sulked this morning. And when they ask you for proof, he asked, I will say, with the gentleness of someone who has wasted too much time being right, that proof is a luxury the curated hour affords. Evidence is what your hands know when you give them work. I showed him my palms, ridiculous gesture. He did not laugh. I will say that sometimes the only proof you're allowed is what your breath does when you stand between two clocks and decide to belong to one. I will say that sanctity without measurement is not superstition, it is skill. We stood in the nave where architecture had been trained to hold its throat open without choking on echo. Children's voices, smuggled in from the square, played tag with the last of the light. The archivist said, when you speak to them, do not flatter their suspicion. Suspicion is a cheaper narcotic than convenience. Ask them to bring their bodies to the argument. I said I would. Then I parted with him in the doorway the way men part who have no desire to dramatize departure. Outside, the air wore that excellent fatigue Rome stages when night comes without apology. I crossed a square and stopped where a saint had once had wings. The hands in the fresco blessed the ground as if the ground had earned it. I lifted my own hand and practiced the blessing. I imagined it traveling across an ocean and landing on a nightstand beside a listening device in a quiet apartment in a city that believes it has made peace with its clocks. I imagined someone, perhaps you, placing a shoe on a coin, or its American equivalent, or its German one, some stubborn metal that pretends not to be warm and then confesses. This is the wakeful hour, not the 13th, not the palace of spectacle, but the ordinary hour that refuses sedation. If you are listening in a country that prides itself on not sleeping while the world suffers, then sleep if you must, but refuse to sleep through your own hour. Refuse to let your calendars outsource your curiosity. Refuse to call relief a sacrament when it is anesthesia. Refuse the seductions of outrage that ask nothing of your hands. Here is what to do, and none of it requires faith beyond the faith you already use when you cross a street. Go where two clocks disagree. Sit between them. Let your body pick, not your opinion. Teach your opinion to obey your body for once. Buy bread from a place that still mistakes yeast for a teacher. Ask the baker whether the dough sulked. If she says yes, ask her what the city did to deserve it. Walk to the place in your town where a map is pretending to be a floor. Every town has one, an observatory turned museum, a courthouse with a brass strip, a university with a meridian inlaid by alumni who ran out of money for statues. Put your shoe on the coin, or the star, or the strip. Wait for warmth you cannot command. Find a painting where wings have been replaced by hands. Learn the blessing. Practice it on rooms that have forgotten what they are for. Listen for the bell that rings when it shouldn't. Do not demand a second. If it comes, be ready to be thanked incorrectly and blamed accurately. If it doesn't, keep the hour anyway. You wanted a revelation. This is the only kind I can afford. The hour belongs to you if you choose it. The pact kept you safe from certain storms at the cost of your appetite for the weather. The Ordo Vigilans forfeited wings so you would not hate your street for not being a runway. They choreographed mercy. Now the choreography has become a habit that no longer remembers why it danced. Habits end when attention begins. Attention begins when bodies stop consenting to be carried. I have spoken about power too long to pretend detachment now. The institution I served is excellent at surviving, sometimes at the expense of its own beginnings. It will continue to archive, to curate, to translate, to correct drift in calendars and souls. I no longer wish to fight it with banners. I wish to invite you to become inconvenient to it, and to every other institution that hopes to keep you grateful instead of awake. Inconvenience is the citizen's virtue. It keeps pacts honest. A last visit to the corridor, then not for romance, but for accuracy. The archivist allowed me one more look at the ledger of hands. I pressed my palm again into the tray and left a second print beside the first, not to double my courage, but to remind myself that memory requires practice. We do not keep copies, he said, closing the book. We keep witnesses. He shook my hand with the professional gentleness of someone who has learned to be thanked incorrectly by people who cannot see what they were spared. On my way out, I stopped in the small theater where wooden citizens circle a painted square while clocks conduct them like a competent lie. I reached behind the proscenium and pulled the plug. The figures froze. Silence arrived not as a condemnation, but as an invitation to hear other things: street noise, a thin siren, two languages negotiating a corner, the raspy patience of leaves. I left the plug on the floor. Someone would find it and restore the motion. That is fine. The hour I borrowed from the mechanism was enough to recalibrate my listening. Now you. This is the part of the film where the narrator says he is tired and the screen asks you to believe him. Believe me only in the way you believe a staircase after you've climbed it. The point is not the narrator. The point is your breath. At the top, when you wake in the night and think a page is turning in a room that isn't yours, do not chase ghosts. Chase your own attention. If a door opens in your dreams, let it. Doors are instructions, disguised as architecture. Do not stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing for those who edit the past is the return of memory. But remember that questions without bodies become a hobby. Bring your hands. Bring your shoes. Bring your appetite for hours that refuse permission slips. Learn to bless without wings. Learn to forgive bells that have lied for a long time, while you learn how to hear. Learn to be thanked incorrectly and blamed accurately, and to keep going. The city will not change because of this confession. Cities change because bakers adjust courage, because bell founders retune mercy, because undertakers insist on honest shadows, because midwives sing against clocks, because anonymous citizens practice being inconvenient, because children miscount and then learn again under skies that are not yet domesticated. I will sleep now, not the curated sleep that pacts buy, but the tiredness earned by walking a map until it becomes a floor. I leave the key on the table, cooling at last, a metal that finally accepts an ordinary temperature. If the bell rings once, smile. If it rings twice and you hear it, step outside. Put your shoe on, whatever coin your city keeps hidden in its hand. Do not look for angels, look for hands. And if you must remember one sentence only, one, to carry into a day that will try to convince you it invented itself, let it be this: silence isn't sacred. It is enforced until you listen together. Then, suddenly, it is a choice.